Okay, welcome everybody to the second session of our virtual job market workshop. We're excited to have all of you here. As I say in the introduction to every session, we know that the job market is a very stressful time for many graduate students. So our goal is to demystify the process as much as possible and provide you all with helpful suggestions on how to succeed at various stages of the process and hopefully relieve some of this stress. We just heard from two great presenters about presentation preparation. Now we're going to talk about academic interview preparation. So in this session, we're very happy to have Alex Hollingsworth, Associate Professor at Indiana University, Anastasia Fedek, an Assistant Professor from UC Berkeley, and Lucy Schmidt, Professor from Smith College. So here's how this session will work. First, each of our speakers will take about 20 minutes presenting their thoughts. Then we will have up to 45 minutes for questions and answers. So jot down your questions so you can ask them during the Q&A, which I will moderate. And with no further ado, I will turn it over to Alex Hollingsworth.
Hi, everyone. Hold on, let me just share my screen here. Control L. And sorry, we're a minute or so late here. I'm the reason we were a touch late. Can you all see the screen correctly? Okay, wonderful. Yeah, I was trying to find an outlet that I could sit next to. So this is a part, I just have a few slides and things that are here of a broader talk that I'm not going to go through the whole like tips for the job market. But if it's okay with the format of this, I'll make these slides available to people. I'm only going to talk about like slide 15 to 24 on here. But this is a thing that I adapted from slides I got from Taylor Jaworski, which are just like tips for the job market in general. So some of it will be, if you look at like slide 1 or something, will have been covered in other sessions as a part of this workshop. But sort of the first tip that I just want to stress here is, you want to be your own advocate when you're on the market. There's lots of people that are hopefully looking out for you in your own best interest. When you're preparing for interviews, when you're thinking about doing mock interviews or anything like that, maybe you're at a program or a place that sets these up for you. Maybe you're at a place where none of that's set up for you. So just be aware if I'm like saying, hey, it's a good idea to do this or to meet with seminar speakers when they come in. If that's not readily available opportunity to you, that it's okay to ask people, right? It's okay to figure out the norms for your own institution. And so I won't cover all the slides at the beginning here, but they will be available. And if there's nowhere to put them, I can put them on my website. I like to think of interview prep and in general, the job market as sort of beginning way before your job market year. And one of the things that people may not always realize when they don't go through the job market process until they've been on the other side for a couple of years is the way we structure flyouts. Where you go and you give a presentation and then you have a bunch of one-on-one meetings with people as sort of mini one-on-one interviews. It's a lot like how an external talk might be if you're just invited to present at another university. So you have an opportunity to sort of sit on the other side, not really as an interview, but to get practice in what those one-on-one interviews on the flyout stage might be like if you just sit and meet with internal or external speakers. I realize here on the slide it says internal speakers, but you should just sign up if you're allowed to for your department to meet with speakers that will give you a chance to practice talking about your research in sort of a safer environment where like a job isn't on the line. So just sort of keep that in mind that there's lots of different opportunities throughout your PhD program before sort of this do or die moment in the 5th or 6th year when you're actually on the market to practice some of these skills as you go along. And if you want to read more about some other tips for different aspects of the job market, there's good stuff in these slides as well. So I'm gonna sort of flip ahead here in the slides that are prepared to talking about interviews, which is the point of this. And something that is relevant for all of us is practice makes us better at things. So I think regardless of the type of interview, whether it's an AEA interview, whether it's the first round or a flyout, it's very helpful to set up mock interviews. A lot of times this can seem very stressful and it can seem kind of scary to do, and because it's a vulnerable experience, you're going out there and sharing your thoughts with different people. So you kind of, for me at least, I found it helpful to sort of increase the stakes while I was learning what I was doing. So you could start with classmates and just maybe someone who's not your best friend that doesn't know your dissertation project and just say, hey, we're going to try to like practice explaining our research to one another. Then you could ask faculty who you know. Then you could ask faculty that you don't know so well, or maybe are friends with someone on your committee or in another department, but in the same discipline. So for instance, if you're an economist in an economics department. There might be economists in the finance department or in a policy school who are perfectly capable of conducting a mock interview and knowing what might be asked at the AEAs, but who you haven't interacted with as much. So doing these sort of mock interviews, setting up this practice environment can help make it less stressful. It'll be the 15th time you've done an interview when you're actually doing it for real. And it's my general preference, and this is what I'm advising my students on the market this year to do, is to try to set up the mock interviews to be as much like the actual interview as it's going to be. So if you're going to go on the market this year, where we think first round is all going to be on Zoom, try to set up your mock interviews as much as possible to look like what that's going to be. And if you're going to be in the market in a few years, hopefully, I don't know, depending on your preference, maybe we're not going to be doing Zoom, maybe we will be. Just try to make it look like whatever it's going to be. So with that in mind, I think the idea of the tips that you need for an in-person interview mostly carry forward to the Zoom interview world. I'll have a few differences on the next slide, but I'm going to start off with just some tips about what this in-person, the first round interview might look like. So you could think about this as something where you've applied for a job, you've received an email that says, hey, we're really interested in you. We'd love to chat with you for 30 minutes. Maybe that's going to be on Zoom or Skype. Maybe it's going to be at the AEAs in a hotel room, or maybe we're not doing that anymore and it's at a table in a conference center. But in some sense, that's sort of going to be your first live communication with other people. So if this is an in-person interview, you're going to want to know who's going to be in the room. So in these slides where I gave some sort of advice on when you're applying to jobs and you receive information, it's okay to ask, who's going to be in the interview. So you can sort of prepare to say like, okay, is it going to be 2 labor economists and a micro theorist? Or is it going to be 2 health economists who are so in your field that you don't need to explain sort of basic elements of your project to them? So this is something that you should ask. And you should just be prepared for sort of a very common beginning to just say, hey, tell me about your research, or tell me about your job market paper, or maybe like a riff of that, like tell me about this other paper that you have listed on your CV, but something that's just like, go, right? And then you should be prepared to sort of speak, and I would call it, to a very intelligent high schooler, terms at the beginning about what is your research, why is it important, why should people care, and then gradually making it a little bit more complicated and a little bit more nuanced, because you're going to get interrupted at some point. Then after some natural point, maybe they'll interrupt you with a direct question. Maybe you'll have sort of finished a bit of your spiel. They'll start talking about not things unrelated to your job market, but probably still related to research. They're basically looking for like, what's your pipeline? How can you explain in simple, clear terms what they're going to get if they hire you in terms of research productivity? Depending on the school, what teaching will be more or less important. They might also ask you about which classes you've taught before, or you want to teach, or how you could contribute to the department along pedagogical guidelines. And then some of that will be about service too. And it's helpful to keep in mind here that like the point of interviews is not necessarily to interview someone to see whether or not their paper should be published, right? To figure out a critical flaw. They might test you to see if you understand what you've been doing, or to see if, like, let's say you have a co-authored job market paper, like, okay, are you a equal contributor here? So it's not that there are going to be no hard questions, but a large part of the interview is looking for a colleague. It's figuring out what you're actually interested in. It's trying to minimize downside risk. So just keep that in mind as you're going through, that these clear explanations of what you're doing are really a very important component of what the actual interview is for. Another thing that I stress, and I think people have very different opinions on this, but I think when they say at the interview, typically the interview will have a few structured questions, and they'll often end it by saying, do you have any questions for us? I don't view this as necessarily an opportunity to learn information about the department, so much as an opportunity to signal interest in the department. So you could say like, hey, thank you for asking me if I have questions. I see from your website, you have this particular undergraduate research effort, and that a few of you have co-authored papers with students. Is that something that junior colleagues get involved with typically, or how does one get involved with that program? And that does sort of 2 things. You do ask a question, so you fulfill sort of the immediate need in the conversation, but it also signals that like, hey, you're taking this seriously. And you're not just asking something like, well, how much does someone typically make here? That's like sort of weird and presumptuous. So I think that's one question where sometimes people handle it differently, and they're more true to like the actual verbal wording, and they just ask some question on their mind. But it's an area where you can sort of elevate and be a bit more strategic. I do think, and I said this earlier, but I just want to stress it again, that it's really important to know who's in the room, and just to not be surprised if the people act like, or maybe actually don't know anything about your underlying research. So maybe someone has sat there and read your paper very carefully and has really detailed comments and questions. And maybe they're just like, on applicant 13 of the day, they remembered liking you long ago, or someone else liked it. And, you're not immediately at the forefront of your mind. I've been told in my statistics class that I use sports analogies too much. So bear with me here. But I do think an important thing to keep in mind here is that there's some ranking of the applicants beforehand. It might not be explicit, right? It's not like they put you on a list. Some universities may do that. But let's say you go in and they're interviewing 30 people and you're ranking 15. Well, they're only going to fly out 3 people. You want to be ranked 1 through 3. So in my mind, ending the interview at being ranked 15 and 30 kind of have similar outcomes, right? Like you certainly don't want to upset people, but you're not getting a fly out. So to use the sports analogy, in hockey, sometimes if you're down, if you're losing, you'll pull the goalie. It's a higher variance strategy, right? You're more likely to win, but you're also more likely to lose by 3 or 4 goals. So I think being enthusiastic and trying to be really sort of put yourself out there is a good pull the goalie high variance strategy. If you think maximizing the chance of a flyout, but also being okay with maybe some downside risk, if maybe you upset someone by sort of being too excited or just being sort of too into the interview, I think that's perfectly fine, right? I'm always looking for someone that's really enthusiastic, that wants to be there, that wants to do this. And if someone's playing sort of a more lower variance strategy where they're just like, I'm just gonna explain my research, then I'm gonna do this. I'm not gonna make any claims about what I'm really excited about because I'm afraid of upsetting someone I don't know. So that's my own 2 cents. You can take it or leave it. Sort of an important thing that I think should be mentioned is that a lot of you, and maybe all of you, if this is the new norm we're going to live in, the first round interviews might actually occur online. A lot of the world, this in particular, has moved to Zoom, and I think it's even more important to be enthusiastic and to try to capture people's attention online. I mean, you're competing with a screen, right? Where just think of all the stuff you're looking at right now or you're doing right now. I'm competing with that for your attention. This is an interview that's going to determine whether you get a flyout or whether you might get a job at a place. So being enthusiastic and trying to capture that intention is really important to the extent possible, right? Like I am not suggesting you go spend like $1,000 on gear and stuff, but just try to have a reasonable quality camera, reasonable quality microphone, a reasonable sort of noise-proof room. My very first interview, this is way before Zoom existed, was on Skype. And I just did it in like the closet of the grad lounge. It was a bad setting to have done it in, right? So, you might have to interrupt people or wave your hands to get their attention if they're like going off on a long comment. Sort of the norms, I think, of what are appropriate on Zoom are different than in person. But a cool thing about the Zoom environment is it creates opportunities for you to have sort of hidden notes for yourself. So you don't need to do my system, but like when I do an interview with like a news outlet or something, and they're going to be doing it on Zoom, I'll put like little Post-it notes around the side of my computer screen, like literal physical things. Like maybe you could do it as different windows, and I'll pull them off after I reach a certain point. So it won't be like the script or anything, but it'll be like, just make sure you mention this or make sure you mention this. So it's like a very easy, visceral, simple to do thing in the moment that doesn't mess me up. I have this application called Fin, and I keep a timer that runs separate from my computer so I can kind of endogenously change how long I'm supposed to be talking about something. Maybe in an interview that's less important, but for me, I like to know how much time is left in case there's certain points I want to get to. And so for this one, I set it for 15 minutes, just because we were a little late in there and maybe people will have Q&A questions, which is why, if you're curious, why it only says 3. Another cool thing of the Zoom world, and maybe this is just in general a good idea to do, is you can practice with the exact setup. So you could just log on to your university Zoom account, hit record, and do a mock interview with one of your friends, and then go back and listen to that recording later on and watch it and just say, like, could they hear me? Was it too echoey? Did I use a corded microphone that was clanking against something? So maybe I should just put it in my shirt. And you can sort of just debug with what you have in the setting. I think that's a really useful way. We do that with our students who are going to go on the market. Another thing, this is just total take it or leave it. I'm really neurotic about certain things, and I like to minimize my personal anxieties. And one of the ways that I do that is by over prepping for things that maybe you don't need to prep this much for. But what I did for every single interview that I had at the AAs in person was I made a little thing that was just like a schedule of my first round interviews. That was like, where is it going to be? How long is it? Who's going to be there? I want some information that I can look at to keep a conversation going, or that's going to be important for the interview. And then I had this printed out, and I actually wrote some of it in like a little black notebook that I take around with me. So I don't have to have like an iPhone or an iPad out. And I would refer to this literally in our meeting because I would have written it out on a piece of paper. So it kind of looks like I'm taking notes. And I'm like, oh yeah, this person, their primary interest is in pond scum development at golf courses or whatever it is here. And then this is also an opportunity where if you've got a really good idea for a question to ask people, oh, I clicked one too many, sorry. You could put some notes to remind yourself of that in here. If you're on the Zoom world doing these first round interviews, you could do a more technologically advanced thing and just have like another screen on your computer or another desktop or print it out and have it in front of you. With the idea here that like prepping for the interview and having these notes is a good idea, at least for someone like me, where I'm worried I would miss something if I didn't otherwise have this sort of structure to rely on. And I just kind of view it as like a mental checklist, not that I need to like accurately address each one of these points. In-person interviews, they're a little bit different, right? This is like as a part of your fly out. So you give your job talk at some point. Often it's 3:30 p.m. to 5 p.m. in the afternoon when everybody needs coffee and the one-on-ones happen in the morning. They're just many conversations with people. Don't be surprised if there's a dean. Don't be surprised if there are people in totally different fields than you work in. If there are students at some universities, it's common to have 3 or 4 students go to lunch with you. But they're typically just conversations. And just, my personal take here, and other people have totally different opinions on this, is I think this is just about a conversation with someone. And once you're at the point where you're on a fly out and you're having these, at least somebody thinks your research is reasonable enough to make the cut. So this is just, are you a good fit for the department or institution that you're having these interviews on? And I think it's completely normal and fine to ask similar questions in the same interviews back to back. I mean, you don't want to be a robot that just has 3 questions, but if you just ask everyone, tell me something you really like about this place, that's totally fine. I don't think that, people might compare notes later, but it's not like that's going to be looked upon negatively. I had one student a couple of years ago in the market that was all stressed about how could they come up with so many different questions to ask people. I was like, this is just like going on a business lunch with someone else. And just keep in mind here, it is a job interview, yes, but it's also just a conversation that you're having with people. And I do a more extreme version of this exact same thing for flyouts. And actually, when I go now to just give like a external talk, I don't have the picture of someone because I don't need to know who they are, but I'll go through it and like make a name, like, okay, I'm meeting with, this particular person. Here's the research interest. Here's a couple pieces of information about them. And if I know them really well, maybe I won't put anything like that, but there might be some people that I've never really had the opportunity to chat with. This past week, I gave a talk somewhere and I knew the person a little bit, but I had a question that I wanted to ask them and I put it in my notes and we were having a really good conversation and I just totally forgot to ask the question. So at the end, near the end of our talk, I just looked at my notes. I was like, oh, thank goodness I looked at this, right? This was an important thing I wanted to make sure we talked about. And then we ended up having an email conversation about it later. So this can sort of be a fallback to make sure you don't miss anything important. And of course, like what you'd put in here might differ based off the place. In any event, I'll try to make these available in some way. They'll either be on my website or we'll make them available through there. These are just broad slides about the job market. A lot of it focuses on interviewing. And just keep in mind here, you got to be your own advocate when you're doing this. So when you're preparing for the interviews and you're trying to get this going, you might have an advisor that cares about you and walks you through the whole process. You might be totally on your own, but it doesn't, either way, you should just be asking questions and trying to put yourself forward. So thank you very much.
All right, thanks very much, Alex. Next up, we will have Anastasia Fedit from UC Berkeley.
Hi, everyone. Let me just pull up my slides. So I'm, I guess, the kind of the closest to job market in this set. So I was in the market 4 years ago, in 2018, and since then I've been on the recruiting committee twice. So I guess I have some experience on the other side as well now, but also somewhat fresh recollections of being in your guys' shoes, which is hopefully helpful. So let me share. Typically have to reshare once I make it full screen. All right, so I kind of going to outline just a couple of things that that I want to cover during this 20-minute session, and then of course I'll be happy to talk about any other things that are on your mind during the Q&A. So I'm going to start with kind of ahead of time. So basically where you are at now. How do you even get interviews? So what do you need to be doing now to maximize the number of interviews that you'll have to prepare for, and then how do you prepare for the interviews? And then after that, I'll talk about kind of in general what to expect in a research-oriented interview, what will be there, what maybe that you're imagining will not be there, given that it's only half an hour. And then at the very end, just talk a little bit about surviving that process. In my experience, the interview stage was the least enjoyable part of the job market. I had a lot of fun at the flyouts. That was a fun way to meet people in the one-on-one half-hour conversations. But the interviews with these kind of repetitive half-hour 1-on-5 talks were just much more stressful. So important to kind of keep that perspective and get through it. All right, so how do we get interviews, right? So you're going to submit your packet. Your packet will include, of course, your job market paper. It's going to be critically important. It's going to include your CV mostly so that people can see what else you have done and what else you're working on. So your other papers will go there. You'll most likely not care to attach auxiliary papers. I remember on the market, I was like attaching every paper I had to my packet. On the recruiting committee, I read the job market paper. I don't really read any auxiliary papers people attach. I will take a glance, right, at kind of what those papers are and read the abstract, but we get that from the CVs. So job market paper and CV are kind of the important things from you, as well as any statements, right? So obviously your research statement, your teaching statement, and then for some schools, like at Berkeley, we also have this diversity, equity, inclusion statement. So those statements are going to be in your packet, and the committee will look at them too. And then finally, the reference letters. And I'll talk about the reference letters quite a bit on the next slide, because this stage, the interview stage, is probably the stage where your advisors are going to have the biggest role to play. Obviously, right, kind of different advisors are different. Some people are more on their own than others, but to the extent that advisors can impact the process, like this is the stage where the committee hasn't met you yet, they're reading your job market paper for the first time, they're going to rely quite a bit on what your advisors have to say about you. So in terms of how much the committee members will actually look at the materials, I think there is variation across schools. I obviously cannot speak for any schools other than Berkeley. My experience as a committee member is that I do carefully look at the materials of a subset of candidates. So we split them up across committee members, broadly by field. I will get some field, let's say empirical corporate finance, and then those packets will be in my file, and I will carefully look through them. So I will read the job market paper, I will read the reference letter, I will skim, what else the person is working on based on their CV, and then kind of form a subjective assessment of each candidate, identify the candidates that seem promising, and then pull it together across committee members and kind of discuss and form a flyout list. So that's, again, kind of one school's data point, but I think not that unusual as a process. And so the most attention in this kind of relatively careful reading is going to go to your job market paper, somewhat evidence of your broader research agenda. So are you able to work on things other than the job market paper, but really also the reference letters. So this is the stage where I'm seeing the signal. I can read the job market paper. For some papers, I can form a more precise opinion than others, right? If they align closely with what I'm working on, then I will have a pretty clear view of my own. But for a lot of papers, right, if there are 5 committee members and we split everybody across 5, a lot of cases, you're not going to be a perfect match with the committee member reading your research. They'll have some opinion, but they're going to also rely on the signal sent by your advisors in their reference letters. So let's talk about those. Obviously, this is something that you don't have that much control over, right? You're not the one writing those letters, but there's still things that you can do to make sure that those letters are serving you in the best way possible. So the kind of things that your advisor's letters can do for you. Of course, first and foremost, they signal your overall desirability as a job market candidate, right? So if your advisor says, this is the best person that I've ever seen on the market, they're gonna win a Nobel Prize, you're gonna have a much better shot at a top school than if your advisor says, that this is a kind of medium candidate that I've advised. And it varies from advisor to advisor how much they inflate their letters. If your advisor has written that every candidate they've advised in the last 5 years has been the best economist they've seen ever on the job market, then that, of course, not going to carry as much weight. But okay, relative to the advisor fixed effect, the variation, what they're going to be able to say about you, will help kind of target you to certain jobs. The other thing that the advisor can do, and if you get lucky with advisors that do that, is they can kind of help you throughout the process by more targeted reaching out. So they write letters, those get submitted to all schools. And then, and I've seen this happen actually more often when things are not going very well. So if a candidate is a good candidate, but for some reason is not getting interviews, or the conversion rate from interviews to flyouts is really not working out, they're not getting any flyouts. I have seen it that advisors can kind of step in and can message right through their personal channels people in the profession who they think like that school would be a good fit for the candidate, and maybe the letter was really good, and then some middle-ranked school didn't look at the candidate, but that would be when an advisor can step in and be like, actually, this candidate would be a good fit for your school, and they're not having kind of all the better interviews. So that's kind of another role. And finally, and then I think this is kind of the role that, for example, some of my advisors may have played in my market, is they can signal any kind of additional information. So as an example, I had some issues with the data provider that kind of I wouldn't be writing in my research statement, but that I've kind of, I guess, been told by people on the market that they did learn about from my advisor's letters. So if there's something kind of unusual about your circumstances, it's much more natural for your advisors to signal that than for you to have to do that on your own. So whether that's kind of issues with data providers and the papers, whether there is some personal circumstance, issues with prior advisors. So right, if you've been working with an advisor and then they switch schools, or for whatever reason, kind of that relationship breaks down, and that maybe holds back a student, that would be something that, again, you wouldn't necessarily want to be stressing in your written statements, but that is very natural for your next advisor to write. Basically be, look, this person has kind of done a lot and they faced this challenge. So imagine without the challenge, they would have kind of done even more. And that kind of helps the committee know your special circumstances through the advice. So again, all those things are what advisors write. So you don't have direct control over it. So what can you do kind of at this stage? Just make sure that your advisors know your work and also you as a person as much as possible. That will help them be able to do these things for you. So to know kind of any special circumstances they want to highlight, to know what your interests are in terms of like where you actually want to place, that will also help them potentially be on the lookout for what schools might be a good fit. And on that end, so kind of making sure that your advisors are able to maximally kind of target you to schools, it does help to be aligned on your goals with your advisors. And that's a process that can be quite like awkward sometimes, right? If if your advisor doesn't think that you're a candidate for the top 5 school, and maybe you do, right? Or sometimes the other way around. But calibrating those expectations can be helpful to make sure that the letters that the advisors are writing are maximally kind of productive for your goals. And again, this depends on the school, but like I have seen it happen that advisors can be like, okay, I can write you a good letter, but if you're applying to the very top schools, then I kind of have to say that you're not a candidate for those very top schools. So then I will say, like, you're great for everything except the top X. Maybe if you just don't apply to those schools, then I don't even have to say that, and maybe the letter will end up looking stronger for the rest of the schools. So again, this kind of conversation can be kind of awkward, on both ends, but to the extent that you have kind of the ability to make sure that you're all kind of working as a team and that your advisor really feels like your goals are their goals, that's going to maximize how hard they try on your behalf. So those are good things to kind of iron out around now, I guess a couple of weeks before those letters are due. All right, so that's on kind of getting the interviews and maximizing the chances that you'll have them. Now let's transition to once you have your interviews or you're starting to have them trickle in with those phone calls. How do we prepare for the interviews? And of course, the key for the interview and the flyout as well, just to be as prepared as we possibly can on presenting your job market paper. So I think that involves a couple of things. First of all, it really helps to be as confident as possible internally about your paper. So you may have presented the paper at these internal kind of brown bags to the faculty. You've gotten all of those comments, all the additional things you kind of people are interested in you doing in your paper. It's November, you don't have that much time. So in terms of at this stage, any kind of additional work on the paper, I would say do whatever you need to do to maximize your confidence in the paper. So if somebody asked a question in your internal brown bag about some robustness and that made you feel kind of unsure, you're like, oh, like that, I don't know how to answer that question, then maybe that is worth spending half a day figuring that out. If not, if it's robustness check N+1 that you don't think is going to really materially impact how you feel about the paper, then don't do that unless you have spare time. So basically at this stage, just do whatever you need to do to maximize your own confidence, because the more confident you are in your paper, the more kind of calm and confident you will be answering questions during the interview. Okay. Then kind of the second kind of component to doing well at the interview is you want to present the paper as much as possible. And okay, at this stage, it's probably a little late, but if there's anybody in this workshop who's not on the market right now, then this is really relevant. Basically, your internal brown bags, any conference you can get into over the summer before the job market, just get out there, present the paper as much as possible, because that will help you accumulate information on how people see the paper, what questions they ask about the paper, and therefore what might be likely to come up in interviews and flyouts. So kind of the more you have presented the paper, the more material you have to actually prepare for the interviews. So again, that's something that's more advice for people who are not yet on the market. Also kind of advice for people that are a little bit ahead of time, but I think this you can also be doing a lot of right now if you're on the market as well, is just tell people one-on-one about your paper as much as possible. This can be, right, as was mentioned, seminar speakers. That's amazing. That was one of the things I did in graduate school that I think was super helpful. But again, not all schools allow you to sign up to talk to the seminar speakers. But if you have that opportunity, do it ahead of time. Anybody you meet at conferences, but also faculty in your school who maybe don't know about your research. That's something you can still be doing now. Just go in, do half an hour talk with them. PhD students whom you haven't been working with as closely, or who are not as close friends, who may not know about your paper that well. Just whoever is willing to listen, tell people one-on-one about your paper and let them ask questions and kind of learn what those questions are. Right, now the actual interview. So the interview is different from a presentation. So I think it's very helpful to present your paper as much as possible to learn how to prepare for the interview. But that said, the interview is going to be different from your presentation. You will get at most 5 minutes to talk about your paper during the interview, and then the rest is going to be questions. So having that kind of perfect hour-and-a-half presentation is not necessarily going to be, I guess, as helpful for the interview as for the flyout. So you want to perfect your spiel, right? That 2-minute or 5-minute version of the paper. You want to be able to speak very compellingly for those couple of minutes that you do get, but you also want to focus a lot on questions, because as soon as kind of those first few minutes, however many minutes departments will let you take, and that can vary from department to department, are over, people are going to start guiding the conversation with their questions. So kind of personally, for example, I'm kind of remembering myself back in that hotel room in Philadelphia, and I think it wasn't even like the spiel that I was practicing on my last day, like before the interviews, what did I want to most have in my brain? But it was, and I guess I can also be a little bit obsessive compulsive. I had like a running Word document with all the questions that I've encountered on my job market paper, and then my like ideal answer. And that was, I think, what I was kind of going through the day before my interviews, was like, what are all the questions people have asked about the paper? And you're not going to obviously remember your ideal answer, but just having read the questions, having kind of recalled your ideal answers from before, I think really helps you feel like any question you're going to ask, you're going to know the answer to. And by the time that you get to kind of fly out, after a while, you will be at the stage where you're like, feel like have heard every question that is coming your way. The set of questions does feel somewhat finite. So the more you do that, the better positioned you will be to answer questions as they come your way. So don't neglect that. Like, don't neglect focusing on the questions. It's not just a spiel, because after the first 2 or 5 minutes, you're going to start getting to the question territory, and that will be the bulk of your interview. And then finally, to echo what has already been said, practice, practice, practice. So you want to practice at this stage, specifically the interview, so you get that half an hour down. Most departments will help you with that. We'll have mock interviews, but not many. So I think I had maybe one. Maybe some departments do 2. Don't remember, one or 2. So that's not going to be that much. You want to do a lot more than that. So what we did with my classmates, and what I really recommend everybody to do, is to set up mock interviews with your classmates. So you can do this, okay, depends on how large your group is. If you're in economics department, it's gonna have, right, you're gonna have more people. If you're in a finance group, you might have only a couple of people, but maybe pool with the econ PhDs to have more people, and then just form groups of 2 to 3. And in that group of 2 to 3, take an hour to an hour and a half, depending whether there are 2 or 3 of you, and take turns. Like, first, I'm gonna be the candidate, and Tatiana's going to interview me, then Tatiana can be the candidate, I'm going to interview her. And just do that with as many groups of classmates as you can. And that's going to give you pretty good additional information about how that interview typically goes, and what kinds of questions people ask, because their classmates are going to be a good representation of people in the profession. All right, so once you actually get to that interview room, how does it usually unfold? So as I mentioned, you're going to get somewhere between 2 and 6 minutes of uninterrupted talking to tell about your job market paper. That's going to depend on the school. Some schools pretty kind of leisurely in terms of letting you finish the spiel. Some schools will start asking you questions long before you think you've finished the spiel. So just be prepared for both ends of that spectrum. After that, it will be questions, and they will hopefully feel familiar if you've done the things advised on the previous slide. And the second part of the interview, so about like 15 to 20 minutes in, is when you're going to shift to kind of things other than your job market paper. So first, most likely the shift is going to be to your broader research agenda. So kind of, okay, well, tell us what else you're working on. And you don't need to have polished papers in your pocket. So your job market paper will be by far the most important paper. The others don't need to be at that stage. But you do need to be able to talk kind of compellingly about your broader research agenda, so that people get the impression, right, that you have an agenda and you're working on many interesting things, and it's not going to be a one-off that you've been able to produce this job market paper and then it's not clear what you're going to be producing next. So I think that can be important. It's going to also be quite important for the flyout stages, for the one-on-one meetings. Many people might, have listened to a job market paper in the seminar and kind of had enough, and then they'll want to talk about something else and see kind of, or perhaps some other of your work is a better fit for their interests, right? They might be more curious about another paper. So those are going to matter, but they're of course going to matter a lot less in your job market paper, right? It's only 15 to 20 minutes in that you get to talk about them. So not having that prepared can kind of negatively impact your interview experience. But having brilliant kind of other papers is not going to save your interview experience if the first part, the job market part, goes really poorly. And then towards the end, in a research-oriented interview, you're still going to get questions about teaching, because that's still important, and everybody wants to hire people who are going to be effective teachers. And you might also get other questions, like, for example, at Berkeley, because we do require statements on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So in my time, that was just a statement that kind of I submitted with my packet, and then never thought about, never like confronted, I guess, during the job market stage. But nowadays, we actually have that as a ending question every candidate does get asked. So I would just say, anything that you're asked to submit in the packet, just be prepared to also talk about it. It doesn't need to be anything extra. Just kind of remember what's on your GI statement and be able to articulate it in spoken form as well as the statement. So again, that's pretty kind of marginal, and it's not going to save your interview, but it can leave, right, a negative impression if it goes really bad. All right, so I think I'm nearly out of time, but I guess one thing that I think I personally overestimated. I think a lot of people overestimate how much you're going to be able to do during the interview, but really just you don't. Is tailoring the conversation to the interviewers. So I remember being very interested in knowing who might be in the room interviewing me, and some schools provide you that list, some don't. That was, I think, the time that diversity in the field was most salient to me, because whenever the list was all white males, I had trouble remembering who's who, but the list was more diverse. It was a lot easier for me to remember which interviewer worked on what. But at the end of the day, you're just not going to really have scope for that in that half an hour interview. It's going to make more sense at the flyout stage, because you're going to have half an hour conversation with each person to know about their interests and to be able to tailor the conversation. At the interview stage, you just want, so don't take that mental load off of yourself. Don't stress about who might be in the room. Don't kind of try to be strategic about what you're going to say depending on that, because it's just not worth it. All right, and then kind of finally, take care of yourself during the interview process. Prepare yourself ahead of time to be as smooth as possible. Kind of in the old days of in-person interviews, that meant, walk the route from interview to interview the day before, so that you're going to feel like you've at least gotten that part of the process down. With Zoom, kind of still be prepared to, to have a schedule that's as convenient as possible. Schedule your breaks where you think you will need the breaks. Schedule the interviews in a way that that's going to kind of be the least stressful for yourself to the extent possible. Right? Sometimes you have more control than others, depending on kind of how full your schedule is, how full the school schedule is, and also just try to relax a little bit. So in the evening, try to do something else. I had ran baths and watched Servant of the People, President Zelensky's series, before they turn into reality. That was my kind of unwinding at the end of the day. Do whatever yours may be, but make sure to do it, and what you shouldn't do is spend all of that extra time with other people going through the same process at the same time, because you're all going to be stressed and you're just going to reinforce each other's stress. So if you're going to hang out with your classmates, don't talk about interviews, but maybe even better, hang out with somebody other than your classmates for those couple of days. And also, this is easier said than done, but try not to think about when and whether you're going to get callbacks, at least until you're done with the interviews. So if you're not hearing back from the interviews that you've done on your first day, don't let that kind of detract from the interviews you're doing on the third day. Just kind of focus on the job at hand, and then you'll worry about the rest afterwards. And once you're done, keep your committee in the loop. At this point, they still can step in, right? For example, if none of the interviews are converting to flyouts, possible for your advisors to potentially signal to talk to some schools, and maybe there is more interest than sort of conveyed. And those schools can still fly you out. And on your side, focus at each task at a time, interviews first. Once those done, shift to that full presentation mode, practice the full presentation. And remember that you're done at that point with what I think is the least fun part of the process, and the flyouts are going to be a lot more enjoyable.
Hey, thank you very much, Anastasia. And last but certainly not least, we're going to have Lucy Schmidt talking about teaching-oriented interviews or interviews at teaching-oriented institutions. So take it away, Lucy.
Let me get the slides set. Okay, can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, and if I advance them, hold on.
Perfect.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so thank you so much for having me. I think this is a really important session for job market prep. And I think one of the things that I think is important about thinking about the kind of institution that I come from. So by definition, you are in a PhD program when you're on the market. So you're in a research-focused institution. So you may know less about institutions that are more teaching focused. Your advisors may know less about institutions that are more teaching focused. So I think it really can be useful in terms of getting a little bit more information kind of about that, how that process works. So I am not the closest to the job market stage of people in the room. I have spent 19 years at Williams College and now am at Smith College. And in that time, I've been involved in the hiring side on about 20 different searches. So roughly one a year for the past 20 years. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about sort of what I think is important for people who might be interested in or potentially interested in jobs that have more of a teaching focus. So the first thing I would just say is that I think this idea that there are teaching focused and research focused institutions is kind of a false dichotomy. So even the top R1s, all else equal, are going to prefer to hire someone who will not do damage in the classroom. So there are going to be teaching questions asked by a wide range of what you might think of as more research focused institutions. Similarly, most teaching-focused institutions care a lot about research. So what do I mean by teaching-focused? I think that we usually think about institutions that don't have doctoral programs, but within that broad set of institutions, there are lots of different kinds of institutions with a wide range of research expectations. So there are public universities that might only have bachelor's programs or might have bachelor's and master's programs. There are liberal arts colleges like the ones that I teach at or have taught at. And even within each of those categories, there are a wide variety of research expectations. So on the ground, what does this mean? It could mean a higher teaching load, although that's going to vary a lot from institution to institution. Smith and Williams both have a 2-2 teaching load, which is pretty similar to that at a lot of research universities, but you'll see places that have a 3-3, a 4-4, so there's definitely variation here. There, at these institutions, are higher expectations about teaching quality and about interactions with students, and fewer, if any, opportunities to work with graduate students. So, okay, what are we looking for when we're on the market? So the first is research. So we are looking for someone who has a strong, exciting research agenda. So everything that Alex and Anastasia said about research prep for interviews is going to be important for us. We want to know, does it look like your job market paper is going to be completed and your dissertation defended by the time you start our job? Is there more than one paper in the dissertation? Does the candidate have concrete plans for what they're going to work on next? This is important both because it sort of tells us what kind of researcher you are, but it also gives us an indication of whether or not you are going to be able to sort of combine high teaching expectations with a research agenda that allows you to hit the ground running when you start at our institution. So this is a necessary condition for us. You have to be a strong researcher. But we also, just as necessary, is we're looking for someone who has the potential and the desire to be an excellent teacher. So can the candidate explain things clearly? Have they taken advantage of opportunities to teach? That's not a necessary condition. I can talk more about that if people are interested. But more importantly, are they enthusiastic about teaching or the possibility of teaching? We are also really cognizant of the fact that we have a limited number of interview slots, and we want someone who's likely to take a job if offered. So last year we had over 400 applications for a position. We were hiring in behavioral for one slot. We're allowed to bring 4 candidates for a campus visit. It's really, really important to us that we're not just looking at people who are sending applications everywhere and have no specific interest. So if you have an interest in a liberal arts college or a teaching focused institution, maybe you went there, maybe you see yourself in an institution that's more teaching focused, signaling that to us is really important. If there are geographic reasons for taking a job in our location, that's really helpful. We take the AEA signals really seriously in terms of trying to decide who we want to interview. The last thing we are looking for is someone who is not a jerk. And I think all institutions are looking for someone that is not a jerk, but in a small department where collegiality is really, really important, where interacting with undergraduates is really important. If you are rude or dismissive to anyone at any stage in the process, that's probably going to cause us to rule you out. Okay, so I'm going to assume that you are at the interview stage, which in my eyes means you've made it past the first hurdle, which means that you've sent us a well-crafted cover letter that signals a strong research agenda, an enthusiasm for teaching, and an interest in our position. That you have a good job market paper, both in terms of economic content, but also in terms of writing quality. We want to know what the research looks like, but we also are seeing that as a signal of whether you will be able to help students write well. And a teaching portfolio that includes a thoughtful teaching statement, strong teaching evaluations, I would say above average, or a statement that puts weaker evaluations in context. We know that research is important. So at a liberal arts college or a teaching focused interview, at least half, probably 2/3 of the first round interview is going to be focused on research. So we're not going to spend the whole time talking to you about teaching. That's going to be an important part of it, but we're going to want to hear about your research first. You need to be able to explain your work and your contribution clearly. It's really important to show this research pipeline. It's difficult to succeed in a world of high teaching expectations if you don't have a pipeline of work in process. And it's worth, and I'll come back to this, Alex's question for the end, I think is a really good one. You want to think about how you might involve undergraduates in your research moving forward. That's going to be a big selling point for you, and a way of thinking about how you link these two parts of your portfolio, the research piece and the teaching piece. Okay, so prepping for teaching related questions. Your goal is to show us that you have both the potential and the desire to be an excellent teacher. So in answering all questions, what I would say is that specific examples are better than vague answers, and it takes a little bit of thought to have good specific examples. The second piece is, in answering all questions, try to convey your enthusiasm for teaching. If you don't have enthusiasm for teaching, if you can't convey enthusiasm for teaching, then it's likely that these types of jobs are not a good fit for you. They are really good jobs if you get pleasure from teaching, and they are not really good jobs if you hate teaching. And I think knowing that about yourself as you're going into this process is really, really important. Okay, if you've taught before, you should be prepared to discuss your teaching experience. So what Anastasia said, right? Anything that you have submitted to us is fair game, and you should be prepared to talk about it. We'll want to know possibly what courses you've taught. Were you the instructor or a TA? How did you present the material? What challenges have you faced in the classroom? Right. What do you like most about teaching? If you don't have any teaching experience, that's not necessarily going to rule you out, but it's going to take a little bit more thought in terms of thinking about how to come up with answers for some of these questions. So show us that you've given serious thought to teaching. Do you have a teaching philosophy that you could tell us about? Why do you think you would be a good teacher? And like I said before, specific examples can be really helpful. If you haven't taught already, maybe you could provide us with specific examples from your experiences as a student, either moments you had that were really formative that you would like to replicate with your own students, maybe experiences you had with your own professors that were not so great and that have sort of taught you lessons that you would want to avoid in the future. So you might be asked what courses you would like to teach. So I think it's helpful if you can come in to an interview like this with a set of somewhere between 2 to 4 classes that you'd be interested in teaching. And these, I think it's helpful if they could be a mix of core classes and electives. So I just wanted to spend a minute talking a little bit about departmental course offerings. So this is definitely the case for places that focus a lot on an undergraduate curriculum. So when we think about the core, we're thinking about the required classes that students have to take for the major. Intro micro, intro macro, intermediate micro and macro, statistics, and econometrics. So departments generally will have to offer these every semester, and it's really helpful for us in terms of staffing to have a number of people who can teach these. So if you can teach one or more of these classes or are willing to teach one or more of these classes, that's often a big selling point. For electives, they usually come in at different levels. So we tend to think about lower level electives that just require the intro classes as a prereq. Upper level electives, which usually require some combination of intermediate, either micro or macro, stats, econometrics. And then at many institutions, you'll have the opportunity to teach seminars, which are junior, senior classes. They tend to be smaller. Sometimes they include both reading and discussing research papers, as well as an independent research project. You could kind of think of it as a baby grad seminar in some way. And we often have a lot more flexibility on which ones of those we offer. So when you're coming into an interview, if the institution that you're interviewing with is looking for someone to fill a particular teaching need. For instance, last year when we were hiring at Smith, we were specifically looking for someone to join the intermediate micro rotation. Our Joe ad said this, it was something that we really needed to fill. So if that's the case, you should be prepared for questions about how you would teach this course. What textbook would you use? What kind of teaching strategy would you have? Would it be lecture, discussion, in-class activities, experiments? Again, specifics, concrete examples are useful. What topics do you think are particularly important to teach in that class? I think what we asked candidates last year was, what do you think is the one most important takeaway from an intermediate micro class? What do you think would be the biggest challenge you would face in teaching that class? So if you want to be seriously considered for one of these positions, it's worthwhile having a set of answers to those kinds of questions about a class that people are expecting you to be able to teach. If there's not specific teaching needs that are mentioned and you're coming in with sort of a list of classes that you'd like to teach, what I would say is that small departments are looking for faculty who can teach in the core. It's a selling point to be able to teach more than one class in the core. But small departments are also looking for faculty who can teach electives that will expand and diversify their curriculum. So I would say I don't know if advisors are giving this advice. One thing that happened repeatedly for us last year is people would come in, they had done their homework, they had a list of courses that we offer. Sometimes they would even know the course number, so they had clearly done a lot of homework and would tell us which of those courses that are already on our books that they would want to teach. And for a small department, that's actually not what we're looking for. For a small department, we have people who are teaching those classes that are already on our calendar. We're looking for people who can fill the holes in the curriculum. So if you're looking at the list of classes that we offer and you see, oh, we don't offer a class on international trade, or we don't offer a class you don't want to say you're going to teach something that's not related to your interests, but if there's something you'd be excited to teach that's not already on our list, that's going to be a sign that you're going to fit in well and that you're going to be able to help us expand our curriculum. We often will ask a question that's some variation of what is your dream course to teach? So having thought a little bit about this, like if you could teach anything in the world, what would you be excited to teach? For some people, this might be a first-year seminar that introduces students to economics for the first time. It might be an upper-level seminar that exposes students to your particular area of research and helps them come up with their own independent research ideas in that subfield. But it's worth thinking about this a little bit in advance. I will say this because it does happen. Do not offer to teach graduate courses if we do not teach graduate students. This has happened a number of times over the past 20 years. When you ask someone what do they want to teach, they'll say, oh, I'd really like to teach grad labor. And then there's an awkward moment where, do we say, well, we actually don't have graduate students, so that's not really an option for us. So again, just doing your homework and sort of being prepared for the kinds of questions you're going to get from the types of places that you're interviewing with. So in terms of wrapping up the first round interview, I want to come back to this question about how you might include undergraduates in your research. If you're asked, how would you include undergraduates in your research, and you can't come up with a good answer for that, again, this might not be a good fit, right? But one of the advantages of being at some of these institutions is that even though we don't teach graduate students, we teach really excellent undergraduates who go on to grad school. So in terms of thinking about how you can have an impact on the world, how you can affect the pipeline within economics, there's a lot of ability to sort of make a difference in these kinds of jobs by introducing students to economics, helping them see all of the wonderful things we can do with our research. It can be very, very rewarding. Most departments will end your interview by asking if you have any questions. It's good to have at least one question, although I agree with Alex that using this as an opportunity to sort of signal interest in something is often a really a good way, a good approach. It should not be something you can easily learn on our website. That's just not great. All right. I'm just going to take one slide to talk about the flyout stage and how it might differ for more teaching focused institutions. In general, flyouts are going to be really, really similar to other flyouts. You're going to do your job talk. You're going to have individual meetings with lots of people. It will likely involve meeting with students. And we take this really, really seriously. So it's not something to take lightly, right? Treat the students with respect. Sometimes that doesn't happen. You'd be surprised. Be prepared to help carry the conversation, especially if you're meeting with undergrads. Remember that they are young. They don't have a lot of experience talking one-on-one to grad students or to professors sometimes. So thinking of questions that you could ask them to keep the conversation going, like, how did you become interested in economics? What are some of the best classes you've taken in this department? What do you think the strengths and the weaknesses of this department are? That you can actually learn a lot by asking undergraduate students those kinds of questions. It could involve some sort of teaching demonstration, either a guest lecture or some sort of activity with students. That'll vary a lot from institution to institution. So again, just being prepared that it might involve something like that. And then what I would say is make sure your job talk is at the right level. And I think the right level here is keeping in mind the fact that in a small department, it's not like you're just talking to people in your own subfield. So your job talk needs to provide enough context so that smart people in other fields can understand what you're doing. There might be students in the room, but you don't need to bring your job talk down to the level of undergraduates, but you need to make sure you're explaining what you can do clearly enough so that the best undergraduates can kind of understand. So it can be a fine line. You don't want it to aim it at the very, very high level, but you also don't want to insult people by dumbing it down. So I think that's all I have. There's a couple of extra resources, articles about the job market for these kinds of institutions. I could put those articles in the chat if people are sort of interested in seeing them. And I'm eager to hear what kinds of questions people have. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Lucy. Now we'll transition to the Q&A period. So the way you can ask questions is by raising your hand, putting it in the chat, and then I'll read it out loud so that it's in the recording. Or you can message me privately if you're uncomfortable asking publicly. By the way, Lucy, I don't know if you meant to turn your camera off, but just to let you know, your camera is off. There you go.
I did not intend to do that.
Okay, it's all good. So we actually already have one question to Professor Schmidt. Are the meetings with students in groups or is it one-on-one?
So usually in a group, because we are trying to fit in as many things as everyone else is trying to fit in a flyout. So often we'll do it as a group. I think it varies a lot. Some places will do it over a meal, breakfast or lunch. Some places might combine it with some sort of teaching demonstration, but usually it will be a group. And what I will also say is that it's never a randomly selected group of undergraduates. It's always the cream of the crop in terms of the undergraduates, because part of what we're trying to do is sell our institution. We're trying to sort of show you the amazing young minds you would be able to help shape if you were to come to our institution.
Right. Another question also for Professor Schmidt. For teaching institutions, will we know in advance if we will do a teaching demo at the flyout, and how should we prepare for this? E.g., will we be given specific materials to teach, know the class in advance, etc.?
So you will definitely know in advance. No one is going to spring that on you in a flyout, thankfully. That would be really mean. I think it will vary from institution to institution what they do and how much guidance they give you. But this is where it's the kind of thing where seeking advice could be really, really helpful. If they've asked you to put together a guest lecture on a particular topic, trying to find someone who's taught that before, trying to get their materials, because all of this is happening at the same time that you're preparing other flyouts, right? So to the extent that you cannot reinvent the wheel and not do a lot of extra work, it's a fine line between sort of the time it takes to prepare it well, but also the time you need to be doing for everything else when you're doing the flyout stage. So again, like to the extent that you can seek out advice from people who've taught that class before, I will say that Twitter tends to be a really good resource for this kind of thing. If you're trying to find someone who's taught a class that you haven't taught before, people tend to be pretty responsive on Twitter to those kinds of calls for help. So.
Okay, another question that came through direct message. This is more general about the process. Should your CV include the abstract of all published papers and working papers?
Yeah, I guess I'll be happy to start on that. Yeah, I on the CV, I think you want to include like everything that that you think portrays you in a good light, right? So I don't know if you have, for some reason, if you have a paper that you like really don't want people to be looking at, then don't include it. But everything else, I think you want to put it on there. I think having kind of higher quantity does have an effect on people, even if they're, if they say they're looking for quality. I think the quantity still influences how they view your overall package. They definitely think of you as more productive with more quantity. And yeah, I think it's kind of critically important to signal that you can do things beyond your job market paper.
And you think the abstracts should go there as well, or do you think this should be listed without the abstracts?
So I think that is something that your home institution might have kind of a sort of preferred template for. So when I went on the market, we actually all just basically used the same template. Every single one of us that went on the job market used the university template, and we did include abstracts. And I think that, to me, that makes sense because you're not going to be like, people are not going to be going to your website and looking at all of those papers at the interview stage. So having them all in one place is just the abstract is probably the most convenient for the committee, but also follow the template of your school's CVs if they have one.
Alex, did you want to add something?
I was just going to add that I agree with the idea of making the information easier for people to find. And I know the question was about the CVs, but I also find it useful to think about all the places where someone might be looking for stuff. So like, for instance, like one of your colleagues at Illinois, I think has a really well-designed website where you can click a button and then the abstract shows up. So if someone's interested in looking at the website quickly to see like, oh, what papers does this person have? The information's there. But if they want to say, oh, I want to know more about that, but I don't want to like go click and download a paper, you can do that. And I tend to view a website as like a interactive CV. Other people have different opinions on this. So to that extent, you can sort of do this on your website and then follow whatever advice your home institution has for your CV.
Thanks, Alex. Adam?
Yeah, I have a question about turnaround times. After we submit our applications, when should we expect an invitation for an interview? And after the interviews, when should we expect an invitation for a flyout?
So I'm happy to offer just a little bit of information. I think it really depends on the type of institution you're applying to. So I don't want to pick too much on the exact words you said, but you said how long after we submit the application versus some other time. There might be a particular time at which the search closes. So if a place is hiring economists, they might wait until, maybe they'll look at the list of people, but until November or something to start looking at the list of people. So it might be around Thanksgiving that you're hearing that you're going to have an interview. But I work at a policy school, and oftentimes we're interested in hiring an economist, but we're also open to hiring a non-economist. And so our search might end in September in a given year. And then you might hear about interviews for us, in October. That might even occur before the AEAs, right? So granted, I know this is mostly focused on economics, but a lot of economists work not in economics departments. So it's possible it could be faster. Regarding your second question, I think it's kind of all over the place. And it depends on where you are in the ranking and how fast the school can move. So if you have like a really fast moving school and you're person number one, maybe you'll hear that same when you're at the AAA still, like 2 days later. But if you're person number 4, you might, and it's a fast moving school, you might not hear until they've invited out the first 3 people, they've given flyouts, maybe they've sent an offer, there's been a no, and then they're still really interested in you. That you shouldn't do that as a snub, but it might be like February before you hear. And then there also are like, universities are bureaucratic nightmares in many ways. So maybe it just could be a slow moving school. They really want to hire you right away. You're their top candidate, and it's still like March for some reason that is crazy and idiosyncratic.
Yeah, I'll kind of highlight that last point, that kind of the university specific bureaucracy can determine a lot. And like being at school that is a little like that, like we have a search plan. So we submit to some administrators exactly how we plan to recruit people. And part of the reason is fairness, so that this plan gets approved and we're being kind of we're giving equal opportunity to all candidates, so that it doesn't look like we ask different questions or potentially like hire in different ways people, right, who may be more privileged than others. So there's like a very concrete plan, and part of that is like we have kind of preset ways in which we convene and review and make determinations. So there's just like no way that we would be able to invite somebody, like even if we know for sure we're gonna want them at a flyout on the day that we've interviewed them, we're gonna like wait until we've seen everybody, convene the group, make that determination. So again, like don't, I guess, over infer if you're not hearing immediately. It may well be the school's fault and not yours.
But and just to add on to what was already said, for places that care about having undergraduates in the process, that means we have to kind of wait until the undergraduates are back for the spring semester. So what we try to do here at Smith is let people know sort of within the week after the meeting, sort of when we're expecting to do the flyouts, but we won't actually do the flyouts until our semester starts, which is the last week in January. And that definitely rules some people out. Some people are off the market by then, but it's something that we can't actually move any faster on that. So.
And I just want to add here. So sorry, Adam, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I was just saying thank you.
So I know we're kind of blending the interviews from application and then the flyouts here. But for instance, this has actually happened to me in Indiana. If you interviewed with a school at the AEAs or via Zoom, and then you get a flyout for another school that's like sort of nearby, where you don't need to take like another plane flight, it's completely appropriate to send an email and say, hey, I'm going to be like an hour away on Tuesday, February 13th or whatever. If you're interested, that's just information for you. And that I did that to Indiana University, where I ended up getting a job. So I don't know if that made things faster or whatever, but I ended up having like a flyout back-to-back days because I made it, it was cheaper for that in some sense.
And I will also add, like, for better or worse, places usually don't send rejection letters. I think this is not something that everybody is aware of, right? So you will usually only hear good news. And if you don't hear anything, it might be that they're not interested, or it might just be that they're interested, but somehow you're not near the top. And when you hear is very idiosyncratic too, because of differences in schedules and bureaucracy and so on. Okay, so we have another question. Given the tight time constraints, how much effort should we spend on research, teaching, and diversity statements? I've been told by faculty members that nobody reads them, but I'm not sure if this is true only for top schools or most schools.
So I guess I can speak a little bit to that. So we do read the diversity statements because that's right, that like we've institutionalized that process at Berkeley, and I guess in general in the UC system. As I mentioned, like in my year, so 2018, still just submitting the diversity statement. Now we have a mandatory question on diversity statements at the end of the interviews, and we actually have a presentation on your diversity statement for like 10 minutes or 15 minutes at the end of your flyout. So we've definitely kind of made sure to put weight on it. Again, it's not going to be right the thing that's going to get you a job. It can at most, harm your chances of getting a job if it's really poorly done, right? So with a poorly done diversity statement, the group may feel like we will have a harder time convincing the school to hire you, and then right, if on the margin, if they're two otherwise equally good candidates, we will hire the one that we will not have issues with the school kind of being upset about the diversity aspect not being strong enough. So again, this is not going to be as critical as the job market paper, but I don't think it's correct to say that nobody will read these things.
I mean, I think, Rob, this is really unfortunate way to answer your question, but I just think it's true. You don't know what's going to matter for an individual school or an individual person. So as was brought up earlier, you're going to the person that will be like selecting you for the interviews might be a person that has like A through H or something in the alphabet. And then they might focus on the research statement, but then the person who's looking at like, S through Z might really be interested in the teaching statement or the CV or the famous people who write your letters of rec. It's not clear what's going to matter. So I tend to advise people, and I treated it like everything is going to matter, which is like neurotic in some sense because there's so much stuff to do, but it's just so hard to offer like a blanket piece of advice. I hear a lot of time people say they don't read the cover letter. We read the cover letter. So if you didn't signal that you're interested in working at a policy school, or you want to live in Indiana or Bloomington or something, like you're going to be way less likely to get an interview with us than someone who put that really front and center in their cover letter. But maybe there's a different search committee at the same school that I work at, because we're so big, that doesn't have that sort of heuristic.
And I think that part of it is just the sheer numbers that we're dealing with. For most job ads, we're going to be multiple hundreds of applications for maybe between 20 and 30 first round interviews, between 3 and 5 campus visits. So you don't want to give any search committee an easy way to cut you from the pile. And I think taking any of these things not seriously gives us an easy way to cut you from the pile.
Thanks. Okay, another question came through direct message. Any advice on what to wear for a Zoom interview? Suit up? Okay, we're hearing, seeing nods.
I think so, but I don't really know if it matters too much. I mean, so I think, I don't know with other places, but we interviewed more people than I think we normally would because it was on Zoom. And we have a very nice group. I think most economists are nice. I don't think that really mattered too much. If someone was like, not taking it seriously or like trying to like put it in your face if they were like wearing shorts or something or exercising while doing the call, that would be negative. I can't remember what anybody was wearing in our Zoom interviews. I don't think it mattered, but most people took it seriously and they were seated in an area where I could hear and listen to them. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. That said, I would probably wear a suit, but I don't think it mattered.
Okay, and then we also have a question about, this is a question about the application stage. If you have a disability, should you disclose that in the application stage, and how should you handle that in general? Does anybody have thoughts on that?
So I have one example of someone who was a former Williams student of mine who went on to grad school who had a disability that she wanted to convey. And what we ended up doing is that I believe she did not address it in the letter. This goes back to Anastasia's point about your advisor's letters. I was writing a letter for her and her grad school advisor was writing a letter for her. And I think we both brought it up and said that she would be discussing it in the first round interviews. And I think that seemed to work pretty well. But again, I just only have that one data point on that.
Okay, any other thoughts?
I think in general, if you think it's relevant, then have your advisor signal it.
Yeah, okay. Is it okay to reach out to particular faculty members in the hiring department after receiving an interview invitation / flyout to ask questions, e.g. someone in my area of specialization? I guess maybe it would be helpful to clarify what kind of questions you're thinking about asking.
Yeah, hi, I asked that question. So like, I'm not sure, like, as I said, it could be interviews, could be questions about what to expect, or could be questions about what is their experience in the department. Like, for example, if there is an alumnus from my department who I, may not know in person or something, like graduated 5-6 years ago, who is there in the department, who is a faculty member. So let's say to reach out to them about their experience, basically. Thanks.
I would probably caution against doing that. I think that's more likely to, I guess, put undesirable kind of weight, right, or work on that person if you don't know them personally. I think it's also my impression is that it's common if there are connections like former students at universities, and if it's actually like necessary information. It's maybe something particular about the school or something particular about that process or like the specifics of their timing. I think it can be appropriate for your advisor to talk to their acquaintances at the school. So for example, in my case, Berkeley was really slow and I was kind of waiting to find out right, with other offers that I also valued really highly, and their timing was very mysterious to me. Where at Berkeley they first said end of February for the offer determination, and then they were taking longer than that. And basically one of my advisors had a former advisee in the department and talked to him, and then came back to me and said look, this is what happened. they gave an offer to so-and-so, right? They're like waiting, then that so-and-so took an offer at Chicago, so they reject them. So like that clarified a lot of things for me about like, right, this mysterious timing and how much of it was driven by bureaucracy. Some of it was, how much of that was driven by, you know, them waiting and some other candidate to not accept their offer. So I think it can be appropriate for your advisor to talk to kind of their acquaintances at the school. I don't think it's generally a good idea for the candidate to reach out directly, especially if you don't know personally.
Yeah, and I think that said, like, it's a great idea. You would just want to be careful of like sort of the implicit draw of the time of the person you're emailing. So like what might be an okay email, you'd want to think about it though, is like after you did a fly out, if you had a really good talk with someone. So first of all, you should be thanking people after the interviews. But maybe you didn't get to meet someone and you're like, hey, you know, I just FYI, you know, I'm bummed that we didn't get to overlap because you were out of there. Just really excited about this. And that kind of opens the door for them to then share things with you. I did receive some emails, you know, before we're interviewing. Someone might send an email like, hey, just FYI, I'm really interested in this position. I'm like totally excited about it. Thank you so much. And I would share that with the other members of the search committee. But it wasn't like they were like, hey, I want to sit down and have like a full practice interview with you or something beforehand, because we want to be cognizant that like everyone's having an equivalent opportunity. It's like a gray area, right? Because I think there are some ways to do it where it's okay. And then there's other ways where people are like, please sit down and chat with me for 4 hours. That's bad. Not that you were suggesting that. But.
Yeah, another instance, I guess, where it's okay is, again, like once you're already in the process, so after the interview, after the flyout, presumably, if somebody asks like a question that is a good question and you didn't have an answer to, and then you went back to your hotel room, right, and ran that regression, entirely appropriate to follow up and be like, you know, that was a great question. I took a look at that in the data. If it felt like the person was, you know, not just like they'll ask a question and then forgot all about it, but if it felt like they really thought this was an important part of your paper and they were like, you know, really attentive and interested, it can be appropriate to kind of send an answer afterwards.
Okay, another question. Could I contact faculty whose work has been cited in my job market paper before the application to do my job market paper marketing?
Could you clarify a little bit by marketing? That's kind of throwing me off here. I would feel really weird if I received an email.
It's yeah, maybe if the person can follow up via direct message. My guess is that this means to market yourself and your job market paper, to kind of do it by contacting people. And correct me if I'm wrong, the person who asked. I think.
Sorry, I misunderstood.
Yes,
I thought you wanted the person to market your paper for you. Sorry.
To market yourself by contacting people whose research your job market paper cites.
So I think that's something that that can be like vary in terms of how comfortable people are with doing that in general. So like personally, I always feel awkward doing that. Sometimes with co-authors, they feel that it's appropriate to, you know, share the paper with people whom we cite, right, to kind of make it better known, and sometimes we do that. And I don't think it's taken badly. I think on the market, right, it can be a little bit kind of trickier, right, how people perceive that. But if it's done in the same way as one normally would, where you think the paper is very relevant to somebody and you cite them and you're just sending them like, oh, here's, you know, just wanting to let you know about this paper, I think that can come across just fine. I've definitely received emails from people, you know, who may not know that well, but who write a paper, again, usually not on the market, but who write a paper that's related to mine, and then they send it over, you know, in case if I have any thoughts. I usually receive that positively. I don't know whether I would receive that differently if it were a job market candidate, but I imagine that not necessarily if it's done in the same professional way.
Yeah, and I think I'll just throw in my thoughts. I think it also depends on the level of school that you're sending this to, right? You know, if it's somebody at Harvard, and based on talking to your advisor, you're probably not going there, then it's unlikely to be helpful. But if it's at a place that's like very plausible for you, it might be helpful to share just in case, because as was said, there's hundreds of applicants for every slot, and you might be weeded out for quite idiosyncratic reasons. So doing that, carefully crafting the email could be helpful if that faculty member then turns around and says to the recruiting committee, oh, we should definitely interview this person. But I think you want to make sure that you're doing it, sort of in a well-crafted way and at a place where you'd be like a very plausible candidate to interview.
And what I'm about to say will like risks reinforcing existing like bad networks and things, but a totally normal thing is that exact same interaction, but someone sends that email on your behalf. So if like I have a student who's working on topic A, and I know casually someone that works on the same topic and the student's on the market, it's not crazy for me to be like, hey, I have a student on the market. This is their paper. You might find it interesting. They're great, by the way. Just let me know if you have any questions. That's normal to do. So again, that's having an advisor that will do it. It reinforces all sorts of weird things, but like, just you want to be careful about like sending weird signals when you're on the market.
Yes, if you can have an advisor do it on your behalf, I agree, that's even better.
And just to follow up on Alex's point, I think the point he made about being your own advocate is really important. So one thing that I see occasionally that I actually find really, really helpful is we're often wondering whether we should interview people who we think would have a really good shot of going to a good research university. But if they happened to have preferences for whatever reason to come to Williams or Smith, we would be really excited to have them, right? So how do we disentangle between people who are just applying because they're applying everywhere versus someone who looks great, who has special interest? So the signals, the AEA signals are one way to do that, but another way to do that is if there are 2 or 3 or 4 schools that you're really excited about, having your advisor, seeing if they're willing to actually send emails to the search chair or to someone they know in that department to just say, I've talked to so-and-so, you are in their top 4. That's useful information for us. And I think probably for a lot of places that are trying to decipher, like, do we have a shot at getting this person or not?
Great. Other questions? I'd actually like to follow up a little bit on what Anastasia said about diversity statements. So when you because this is new to me too, so when you ask about the diversity, how exactly is that question phrased? Could you give an example?
So I honestly, I don't remember because I've never had the role on the search committee of asking that question. It's usually the committee chair that's a residual claimant. But there's we even have specific wording because again, we want to be asking kind of all questions to all candidates equally. But I think it's just kind of, can you discuss your sort of approaches, experiences, and views on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and sort of leave it open-ended, and then people can talk about basically the same things as they write in their diversity statement. And I think we give people a heads up. I think like when we invite them for the interview, I think we mentioned that in the invite. So again, it's like that doesn't spring up as a surprise after people are prepared for only research and teaching questions. And it's just a couple of minutes at the very end.
I have a list from another school. I don't know if I'm allowed to share the whole list or not. I don't think it's anything, but not my school asks this question. I have their full list of interview questions because they ask everyone the exact same questions and have been pre-approved by a group. So just for what it's worth.
Okay, I will just read it out loud so that people watching the recording can hear. What does diversity and inclusion mean to you? And how have you addressed this in your previous research, teaching, and/or leadership/administrative experiences?
It sounds about right.
Yeah. Other questions? Everybody feeling well prepared for the job market? Okay, well, if there are no more questions, I'll stop. Oh, okay, I guess we do have a question. are there cases when people have two job market papers?
So two planned job market papers, I think very rare. What can happen is that schools can ask you to present something other than your job market paper. So that happened to me, where there was one school where somebody in another department had some disliking towards my job market paper. And so the department that was inviting me to present told me, we want to fly you out after the interview, but like somebody in another department has an issue with your job market paper, can you present something else? But that is obviously like more stressful, more work, because now you're kind of shifting gears from your job market paper to another paper. But it worked out fine. I got an offer from that school, so that can happen. But I think it's a lot of work to perfect more than one paper. So in terms of, I guess I'm seeing kind of the clarification in the question that if you're applying maybe through two fields, right, like say policy and econ departments or econ departments and finance departments, whether it makes sense to have two papers. I think that's just probably more kind of extra labor that you'll be putting on yourself than is worth it.
Yeah, and I think in general, having two fields is a risky strategy, because people will look at you and not know whether you'll be doing research in their field or not. And sometimes the search is for a specific field. And so if they hire you and you end up working in the other field, they might not get to hire for a while after that. And so that makes it very hard for departments to look at candidates who have, if the fields are, very different from each other. That can actually be a harmful strategy, I think.
Having two papers is always better than one, though. Like if ignoring the two fields bit,
Right,
like if you had I could do either one of these. This one's R&R and this one's there. That's a good thing. But the two fields bit, I totally agree. There's a lot of infighting about how you get to hire, or who you get to hire. Excuse me.
Yeah. So then labeling one of the papers as a job market paper can send a signal about the field that you see yourself in, and downplay the other field, while of course keeping that paper on your CV.
Sorry, I just follow up question. Like for example, students are aiming to become like applied microeconomics and working on both like food and environmental economics, or like for example, finance and environmental economics. Should we consider those as two separate fields, or like if it's, I'm trying to think about, like you mentioned, like working on like a declared myself or ourselves as in one field will be better for two fields. But I just feel if there's a kind of combination between, like for a job market paper,
I mean, one way that this could work is to stress the complementarity between things, right? So like the particular examples you give, I view as like really complementary. If you're like, I'm really interested in broadly applied microeconomic techniques, well, there you go. You can teach a bunch of courses in micro, applied micro, all these things that can, econometrics that can help the university. And then I'm really interested in applying those to how environmental economics and specifically food policy or agriculture works. I think that's all coherent and not like, it's not like you're macro and, I'm trying to think of something that's the most different from macro possible, but, like macro theory and food policy, right? Like maybe those could overlap, but it's like harder for me to see that immediately.
Yeah, those are more almost topic areas than like broad fields. And then still you probably have a stronger paper that would be the best job market paper, but you can list those as topics, research topics of interest.
Well, and for us, the fact that you would then be able to teach electives in several different fields or topics would be, conditional on the quality of the paper, and saying that you're sort of working at the intersection of these topics, like being able to teach additional electives is something that we would find appealing.
Also, to Tatiana's earlier point about schools having kind of spots for specific subfields, That kind of varies across where that constraint comes from. So if it's coming from within the group, let's say, the group is low on labor economists, and the labor people in the group, like it's our turn to hire, and then right, the group agrees that we're hiring them a labor economist. There's going to be something where it's going to be more important to strongly fit within that field, right, labor. And if you're having kind of some papers in labor, some not, then the labor economist might not be willing to spend their spot on that person, as was pointed out earlier. But if the constraint is coming from somewhere else, like say the dean's office, so as an example, if your dean's office tells you, if you should hire somebody in like environmental, right, or like in sustainability, and then you're kind of finding the best person who works on that, but also works for your group, then that's the kind of case where having broader kind of complementary interests can actually be helpful, where you kind of check the box, but also are of most interest to people who are currently in the group. So that will vary from school to school and kind of where their constraints come from.
Okay, fantastic. Well, that's all the time we have. Thank you very much for coming. Let me just